The HR Stories podcast is brought to you by the team at HR Stories. The team at HR Stories helps businesses, nonprofits better manage the employee experience, providing the tools, training, and resources they need to take their organization into the next level. To learn more, go to our website at theteam@hrstories.com. Each week on the HR Stories podcast, management and HR consultants Chuck Smickian and John Tallheimer dive into the stories that matter to small business owners, nonprofit leaders, and HR professionals. We continue to be amazed at how many companies allow poor decision-making, lack of knowledge, and in some cases, hubris to cause harm to the organization. Each week, we discuss stories where companies must pay large fines, lose great talent, or even stain their reputation within their communities. And we tell you how to avoid that same fate. Welcome to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. This week's lesson centers around paying our employees for hours worked. In particular, when do we have to pay our non-exempt employees? But first, let's talk, Chuck, about what's happening in the HR news.
All right, John, it's great to be here. Folks, I'm Chuck, co-storyteller here on the HR Stories podcast. John, once again, a great introduction, and I'm excited to get into the stories. But hey, big news from the United States Supreme Court over the past several weeks. It keeps coming out. There are news stories upon all kind of editorials, but there were three rulings that HR people need to keep an eye on. The first one is Groff versus the U.S. Postal Service. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Groff, who is a postal worker, saying that the U.S. Postal Services must accommodate his religious belief of needing Sundays off.
Wait, wasn't that always the law? I'm very confused by this. I thought that was the law.
Yeah, and it is the law in many cases to accommodate religion, but the Supreme Court clarified and better defined the phrase undue hardship, saying that to deny accommodations, religious accommodations, the employer must show that it would cause an undue hardship and not something that was previously known as de minimis cost.
Right. So de minimis means like a trifling cost. So for instance, a company can say that we will not provide accommodation because it will cost us too much money to print a new schedule.
Right. So that's de minimis. And so that's a good example. HR professionals do need to pay attention to make sure we have a clear statement of undue hardship before we deny religious accommodation. Now, the challenge is, John, that the court didn't give exacting language. So we can expect some more court cases. The other, and if I can just share that in the hospital, this will have a big impact in the hospitality and the service industries. When I was growing up, places weren't open on Sunday. A lot of places I would go to, it was stores are shut down, restaurants are shut down. The blue laws, they called them. And then eventually stores started opening up on Sundays, started requiring employees to work on Sundays. In the hotel resort industry, Sundays is a big turn day. We got a lot of checkouts, especially in transient hotels, some check-ins for the week. So having housekeepers and people working on Sundays was huge. And sometimes we actually said, look, we need you to work Sundays. And there were folks saying, I need to go to church, and we would adjust some schedules, but a lot of times it was tough. But now there's going to be a higher bar, and hotels, resorts, theme parks, service industry, retail, food are going to have to accommodate unless they show it's an undue hardship. The only thing, John, is I think it will become an undue hardship if all employees want that day off. I don't know how. So there's a lot to go through. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
But the other thing is it applies to all religious beliefs and sincerely held beliefs as well.
Yeah, and I think, to me, I think you bring up that fascinating point, right? Because what the Supreme Court did was, look, they really defined the undue hardship, but they didn't define it completely, right? And so they said, look, undue hardship is something that is going to cause significant difficulty for the organization, right? And so we go back to that ADA definition. They didn't go that far, but they did say, look, it's not just a little trifling thing, because a lot of companies would say, well, I can't give you off for that, or I can't let you pray during the middle of the day, or I can't let you wear that garment because of this. They're going to really have to dive into and go, look, this is why it's causing us an undue hardship. And it will be interesting to see what happens for those individuals that take the schedule, right? I take the schedule and I'm like, okay, yep, I know my schedule is on a Sunday and I know that that's when I want to go to church, but I'm taking that schedule. And then 6 months in, go back and go, well, I can't do this schedule anymore.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this is going to go to the federal courts and the district courts for clarification. So we'll see a lot of that clarification probably over the next year or so. But I do think that employers have to be paying attention to this for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we have some other things to discuss, but like I said, it does hold to all religious beliefs and sincerely held beliefs. So not to get into too many political discussions, because I know sometimes we can go into that, but this was celebrated by a lot of conservative Christians, and so they were like, oh, look at this, it's all about Sunday and that sort of thing. And I caution our listeners, everyone, to remember it's all religious beliefs. So it reminds me of a cartoon I once saw where it was a little like 5-panel cartoon strip, and it was the teacher saying, hi, we'd like to do our morning prayer here. It was like an elementary school classroom. It was just a stencil drawing. And the next thing was, Johnny, would you like to say today's prayer to God? And then the third section was little Johnny starts with Dear Buddha. And then immediately the final panel of the cartoon teacher cuts Johnny off, says, okay, Johnny, thank you very much. That'll be all for today's prayer. In other words, if you're going to allow prayer in school, you've got to allow all religions. I saw
sincerely held belief, right?
Sincerely held beliefs. Yeah, I saw something in Florida. Those of you, our longtime listeners, know I'm in Florida, and we have been in the news a lot on a number of things. There's a lot of book controversy. What's in the schools? What's in the books? Banning these books, that sort of thing. Well, now there's a push. It was just in the Orlando Sentinel this week where there's a push to ban the Bible, right? Because now there are groups coming out saying, well, the Bible has all kind of explicit things in it that's not age appropriate for certain grades. And there's a big push now by an activist group to do that. So it can go both ways. And so we just we'll watch and see, folks. That's why you're listening to the HR Stories podcast. We're going to bring you these news and these insights as best we can.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. And I think they're really things that we all need to be paying attention to. Now, we mentioned there were 2 other court cases. What were those, Chuck?
Oh, sure. The other was a Supreme Court saying affirmative action cannot be used in college admissions as a factor.
Right. So will that be an impact on employers in the United States? How will that impact?
Not immediately and not directly. And there is some debate and thought about that. But I believe, and I know I've talked to you about this too, we can expect perhaps individuals that may want to sue companies for using affirmative action in the hiring process. So this could open up and we know for a fact there's case law, there's legal precedent, and people take other things and pull it together and say, well, now that applies to this. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I definitely think that's going to be interesting. I'm going to be interested to see it's adverse impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion work that's being done in organizations, the ESG work that's being done in organizations. The companies I've talked to across the board have like, we're not stopping. Like we're still going to do it. They know research backs us up on this, that having a diverse and inclusive workplace is much more productive to the organization. They produce better results. So I think that's going to be continuing on there as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree with that. Some of the things I've read, DEI is technically not affirmative action. I mean, it is doing affirmative, but it's not, it shouldn't impact diversity, equity, and inclusion. There is so much more to it than just filling quotas. And that's against the law. The EOC. It is, well, there's so much we could talk about it, but taking those three words, diversity, going to maybe other areas to recruit your people, different colleges, different parts of town, different equity, making sure everyone is treated equally, and inclusion. You've got to have that piece because you have so many diverse populations. How do you make everyone feel welcome? And I don't think this should impact that. But I do also believe that there are some folks that don't understand this ruling. They don't understand DEI, and they're just going to start going out trumpeting, oh, look, no more DEI. And that's not necessarily true. And it doesn't even really correlate.
No, yeah. They're on in the same plane, but in two different fields, really. All right. So what's the last case we need to be paying attention to, Chuck?
Sure. So in this case, it ruled in favor of a lady named Lori Smith. She's a web designer in Colorado who says her religious beliefs would not let her design a website for same-sex couples.
So how is that going to impact employers across the United States, Chuck?
Yeah, well, I could see that where employers and even employees, John, may feel comfortable in treating or discriminating LGBTQ communities or members at work. And I had to really read into it a lot more to fully understand it, because I started, okay, how does this apply? How do we not discriminate and say, well, my religion doesn't believe in mixed race couples. My religion doesn't believe in mixed religious marriages, or I don't want to work with someone that isn't from that LGBT community. And so it really is interesting. And I know you found some great resources for that I can share with our listeners.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I think we were having a conversation about this offline, and we're having this conversation. We're thinking about how will we perceive this going forward? And I think both of us were sort of like, oh, that's a good question. How do we look at that? Right. And so I came upon, now I'll let you do the kind of go through all the 4 steps, but Eric Meyer, who is a lawyer from Fisher and Boyles, right? He's a lawyer there. He puts out a daily email about court cases in the HR employment law stream. And he did a really good job. At least I thought he did a really good job of detailing why this probably would not impact employees at work, right? In the workspace. Do you want to go in through those 4 things, Chuck?
Sure. Yeah. And whether you agree or not agree, it is interesting to see how the Supreme Court kind of carved this out. I expect there will be challenges, and there will be, as we talk about, other cases that will stem from this. But number one, Eric says the ruling, and he was a great summary. I've read a number of summaries on this. I love his summary, Eric. Thank you for doing this. But the ruling was limited to public accommodations, more specifically forced speech of businesses that serve the public. And Eric used an example. Would you force a Muslim movie producer to make a picture or film about, and he used the term Zionist movement, I guess, which would be Jewish people? Or would you have an atheist that does murals be forced to bring and take on an evangelical client that says, please paint this, mural on my church or on this wall that is very evangelical. So that was his first point.
And I think that's a good point when we're looking at the one particular case, right? It's about public accommodation and what can we force a business to do that's against their sincerely held religious belief, right? And so again, the Supreme Court's kind of towing the road between freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and what do we as individuals get in discrimination, right? How do we deal with all those three things together? So what's number two?
Number two, refusing to work with LGBTQ workers has nothing to do with the First Amendment. We've talked about this. The private sector employees don't have free speech rights at work. And he gave this example that if an employee tries to use free speech as a reason not to work with someone, then they're not working, and therefore they're not really covered. So that's a bad reason for someone to use. Although I have to imagine there are going to be people out there that are going to push that. And
and I think the important part, I agree with everything you're saying. I think the important part here is that as private sector employers, we don't have free speech in the workplace, right? It's just not a right that's giving to us. Now, public sector employees have a little bit more, right? Because First Amendment says that the government shall not put any laws and regulations to stop our freedom of speech, right? That's a very vague way to say it. But you don't have that same right as an employee for an employer. So kind of that's important, I think.
Absolutely. Eric brought up a third point. He said, look, let's not forget about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And Title VII is an anti-discrimination statute, meaning coworkers cannot refuse to work with people because of their sexual harassment or, in fact, any other protected class.
Right, their sexual orientation or their their gender identity, because right under Title VII, one of the protected classes is sex, right, or the gender of that person, and we can't say, well, I'm not going to work with that person because of that, because that is discrimination. We all have those discriminatory policies in there, and I think that becomes really important to kind of pull out too.
Yes, sexual orientation I had meant to say, so thank you. And then number 4 was Title VII is designed to enable individuals with sincerely held religious beliefs to observe their religion and work, not refuse to work.
Right, which is what you were saying earlier, right? Again, the concept isn't like, well, we're going to give you a religious accommodation, even if that means you're not going to work. That's not the case. You're going to get a religious accommodation. You still have to do the work, right? And so kind of figuring that out and how to do that.
Although I
love Eric's way he thinks. I love that he can simplify it for us. And bring it out. And so we can be like, okay, here's what we need to be paying attention to. So highly recommend Eric Meyer's email. If you guys aren't getting it, definitely recommend it. Lots of good information in there. So always recommend that. So we have to thank Eric for allowing us to kind of capture that and kind of talk about that. It's amazing how much the Supreme Court, again, every year the Supreme Court takes up cases that we need to be paying attention to. One of the things, Chuck, that I think you've been really good advocate for, and we've seen it on some of the podcasts, is the Supreme Court cases that have changed HR. And so if you haven't, ladies and gentlemen, I would go back and you'll see a list of those. Look at your episodes and look at our podcast episodes, and you'll see a list of, and I think we've always labeled them a Supreme Court case that changed HR. We have 3 or 4 of them out there. I know Chuck is biting to do a couple more of those, but I think that this is really important stuff, right? And kind of diving into that.
Absolutely. All right, listeners, you've been listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there is a lesson in every story. If you are interested in supporting our work, please go to the support button and click it. It provides us a monthly contribution. The money will allow us to keep our work and, of course, keep our producer, Samantha.
And keep her paid, as it were, right? So let's take a quick break, and we will be back in a minute.
Hey everybody, it's Chuck with the team at HR Stories. The HR Stories podcast provides weekly lessons along with compelling HR news in a storytelling format, but we have found our listeners want more. We know it's easy to be overwhelmed managing the day-to-day responsibilities of HR. We know HR can be isolating, and our listeners want a supportive community to turn to for advice and inspiration. And we've been there. We know what it's like. And that's why John and I at the team at HR Stories have created a membership program that goes beyond the HR Stories podcast. Imagine an education support group for new and experienced HR professionals alike, with twice monthly sessions and an opportunity to collaborate and network with your peers. Whether you are an HR team of one or you have HR as a responsibility, our membership program is designed to offer benefits that will elevate your knowledge and advance your career. Simply go to team@hrstories.com and click on the membership link in the top menu bar to learn more, or check out the link in the show notes below.
Welcome back to the HR Stories podcast, where today we will be talking about hours worked.
Yeah, John, I wanted to take a moment and read a review that we got last week. And listeners, if you can, we would love for you to, whether you're in Spotify or Apple Podcasts, just if you could rate us and review us. Those help us. They help the algorithms, and it helps get our message out there. But this was a really nice review. Thank you for whoever wrote this. Lots of we don't see who wrote it. They're anonymous. But it says, great podcast. I gave it 5 stars because the content is relevant, and each case is thought-provoking. Podcasters are on point, fun. They do a great job bringing some nuggets of wisdom to the listeners. Keep up the good work.
Aw, that's nice to hear. I love that you pulled that out, Chuck. I think that's fantastic. Always good to hear. We have over 11,500 downloads of our little podcast, Chuck. So we're not way up there, but we're doing pretty good. We're doing better than we thought that when we started this. And again, we do this for a lot of different reasons. We do this to help ourselves clarify what's going on in the HR news, to keep us up to date. We also do it for you, the listener, to make sure that you're kind of paying attention. Fact, Chuck, speaking of listeners.
Yes.
Do we have a question this week?
We do. Hold on. Do you hear my papers ruffling? Waiting. Ruffling. Okay. Hold your horses. We got the question of the week. Let me pull my notes up here. Okay. Gracian Hardy. Gracian is one of our top contributors on the Team of One HR community on Facebook. Folks, if you've not had a chance to sign up, if you have Facebook, do yourself a favor, get to the Team of One community on Facebook, HR community. It is fantastic. Gracian is one of our top contributors, and Gracian asks a question that popped up about what rights, if any, remote employees who move to a different state have if their employer wants them back in the office. Do employees facing this problem have any legal rights?
Yeah, what a great question. There was a story that my wife was telling me about somebody at her company, right? And so they had all gone remote, right? They had all gone remote, and this individual had moved way out of state, was way out of state. And her boss wanted her to come back in for a meeting. And she's like, well, that's going to be a little bit hard because I'm not in the state anymore. And they're like, well, you need to get into the office, right? And so I don't think there are any legal concerns from the employer standpoint of view, right? I think the employer has a right to tell the employee where they need them to be. Now, I may have missed the state regulation. I don't think I did, but somebody can let us know, like, oh, in our state, blah, blah, blah. So I don't think there are any legal concerns, but I do think, on the other hand, there are major cultural impacts on the organization, right? And I think what happens is when you've told an employee, right? And so when you've told an employee, hey, yeah, go ahead, you can work remote, you're remote, that's great. And then you ask them, say, nope, I need you back in the office 1 day a week, 3 days a week, 5 days a week. I don't think they're going to work as hard, right? I think they're going to leave your company as soon as possible, right? We have to be there. Now, the challenge I see legally, Chuck, is that if we do this for one class of individuals and we don't do it for everybody, then it could be seen as discrimination, right? We want to be kind of really in there. What do you think about this, Chuck? What's your insights to this?
Yeah, so if you've allowed your employees during COVID or over the last few years to work remotely, and you've allowed them to move anywhere in the United States, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Did you do it with or without a policy? What does your company policy say? Some companies say, okay, you can work remotely, but you still need to be within driving distance of the office in case we ever need you to come in. Or you can move anywhere you want in the country, but if we need you to come in, we will provide transportation and fly you in. But you're right. Depending on the states, and a lot of times states are just keeping up on the law regarding this, but federally right now, there would be no law that would be violated. Although I got to tell you, there is one that I thought of outside of what you suggested, okay, about if you're just making one class based on, race, religion, that sort of thing to come in. But there's no federal law saying, because we're all employees at will in most 49 states, and you could say, okay, we've changed our policy, we need you to come in. And most policies have said that we reserve the right. However, I have to tell you, John, if I allowed certain employees to move away, and then I say, well, you need to now come into the office and you need to do it within 2 weeks, you need to be here, and I can't, I've created, there might be a cause to charge creative discharge. In other words, saying, I created a situation, your company created a situation, and now I know these employees can't come in, so therefore I'm going to lay this requirement on them, knowing they can't meet it, and therefore they're going to be terminated. I'm going to shed some employees, and I don't have to do a layoff. So there are some, outside of the cultural issues, there could be some legal things there. And like I said, was it done with a policy, without a policy, and what did state regulations and laws say?
Yeah, I think those are great insights. I definitely think the policy is the key, right? And so if you are allowing employees to work remotely, clearly state if you want them to come in the office at some point, you're like, hey, you're going to need to come office. So I was thinking about, we had a friend who visited us the week before July 4th because his business is in Nashville. He lives in Florida. His business is in Nashville. And they're like, we need you to come into the office for a week. And so he flew up on Monday and then stayed with us until Friday. And what I found fascinating was that the company was paying for his airfare. They would have paid for his hotel. He didn't need one. And his rental car, right? And so here he was, he's not a high-level person in the organization, important key, right? Important clog. But they were paying for it, and they're like, he's like, well, I'm probably going to have to come out every quarter. And they're going to require me to do that, which I think is a good thing for the organization to require, right? And that kind of stuff. I was just surprised they were making, and so I don't think you necessarily need to pay the employee, but you want to be fair about it and be consistent about it. And so make sure that you're doing that there becomes good. So really, I love this segment, Chuck. I love when we have these questions and we get to chat about them and talk them up and really kind of think through them And I love that you get to share your wisdom. Like to me, it's like I get to listen at the font of wisdom and get all that information because it's so important. It's like, oh my God, that's so, great. So
sometimes, John, I don't know where it comes from. It's like speaking through me. But listeners, if you love our listener segment, check out our Q&A listener sessions where we address your questions. Every other week, we have a segment where we address 3 questions. It's about 15 minutes long, and we should get to the story, John, before Sam, our producer, fires us.
Sam, don't fire us. Good point.
Okay, so go. I'm waiting.
Hold your horses. We're on a low budget, and I need to crank up the storyteller.
Get those hamsters going. Get the hamsters
in the background, cranking up the storyteller. I love it. All right. As I mentioned before, today's story is about how we pay our employees for hours worked. In particular, when is an employee on the clock and when is they are off the clock? So I pulled this story from the news, but we know it happens all the time. And so I'm going to talk to a story about an individual that was working at the Home Depot and what was happening to that individual. So his name was Jorge Almazar, and he worked for Home Depot on the night team, which was responsible for stocking and merchandising products at the Home Depot stores. He worked a 10-hour shift per week, 10-hour shifts 4 times per week, which also included travel time, Chuck, between the different stores. So he had to go back and forth. So while the rest of the world slept, Jorge and his team would be locked in the Home Depot stores preparing for the next day.
Okay, did you say locked in?
Yes, I did. It was one of the most fascinating part of the story, although they didn't really spend a lot of time on it. One of the issues in this case was the manager would have to unlock the store so they could get their breaks. And occasionally the manager wasn't available, so they could not take their breaks.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to get into the whole OSHA concern of locking people in the store. I would hope that there were some fire exits that were unencumbered or no egresses. Wow, that's really something.
No,
oh, right,
I'm just
wow.
Like, and it wasn't the main part of the story, and I'm reading like the court case, and they just kind of mentioned that offhandedly. Wait, they're locking the employees in the store so they can't get out to go get their lunch or dinner or whatever you want to call it in the middle of the night, right? And so it was fascinating to me, but there's so much more to this story, right? The biggest being far that Jorge and his team, after they punched out for the night, right after they were done in the morning, when they punched out for the night, they were told to wait until the final inspection was done.
Yeah. So I just want to get clear. They would punch out on a time clock and be required to stand around before they were dismissed. After they were clocked out, they still had to stand there. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's not legal. That's, I mean, that right there says we got problems.
Right. Yeah. It's illegal, right? That time is considered hours worked because it benefits the employer, right? And so understanding when we're thinking about hours worked, we have to think about when it benefits the employer, right? Standing around, when it benefits wait time, when it benefits the employer, it has to be paid. See, the managers were asking them to wait around. Waiting time for the benefit of the employer must always be paid.
Yeah, that reminds me of a Target story, of a case from Target where the manager would ask at the end of their shift for employees to help bring shopping carts in. The employees had already punched out, but they would then have them go out to the parking lot and says, oh, could you just bring all those carts in before you get to your car? There's also other court cases out there, especially during COVID, where employers required employees to go through a screening, to wait, to get temperature checks, things like that. And those came out to be, you're doing that for the benefit of the employer. You need to be paid.
Right. And so I understand that when it's waiting time, if it's for the benefit of the employer, it should be paid.
Yes.
Now, if the employee shows up and says, hey, boss, I'm out in the parking lot. If you need me, I'll be waiting out there. that is not for your benefit, right? Even if you use them later in the day, it's not for your benefit. You don't have to pay them for that waiting time.
Yeah. So tell us more about George and what happened.
Yeah, and so another thing that arose was that Jorge and his teammates' meal breaks were often interrupted by in-person requests or by work-related calls to their personal cell phones. So they would be on their break and the manager would ask them to come in and do work.
Yeah, which would be okay if you paid them for that. But if you don't, then once again, that is something that can get an employer in trouble.
Right, exactly. In this case, Home Depot was not properly paying those employees who had their break interrupted. Remember, the Fair Labor Standard Act says that the break under 20 minutes has to be paid.
Yeah, and anything over 30 minutes doesn't have to be paid. But I got to ask you this. Actually, John, I have to say it's not uncommon, and even as an HR director in working for companies outside of being an HR consultant, this is one thing I had to correct all the time. Hourly employees taking their lunch break at their desk, hourly employees being asked to listen in on their radio walkie-talkies, hourly employees doing a number of things. So it's not entirely uncommon, but employers, I don't understand why they don't get this part. And I'm surprised that Home Depot fell into this. But what else happened?
Right? I mean, I think one of the things we have to understand is that, and we see this all the time in these large companies with many, many bricks and mortar stores, they have a general manager or a regional manager that has come up through the ranks, and that's always the way it was. So they do their things. I love the whole concept of the two-way radio. Like, you have to listen to it. Well, they're not working. You just have to listen to the radio.
Yeah.
That's working, right? You're asking to do something that they would not normally do during their break. I haven't even thought about the two-way radios.
So, and you're right, folks. Listening point, and John and I teach this in all of our seminars. By the way, you can hire us. We'll come in and talk to your management team. Is train your managers on basic employment laws. But John, what else happened in this case? Is there anything else?
I love that, right? I mean, again, this is the manager, right? It's always the manager. This case is complicated, Chuck, right? There was another charge where the Home Depot was not properly paying them for travel time.
Oh, right. You mentioned about that they travel back and forth between stores.
Yeah, right. And so what was happening was that these individuals were driving between the different stores. So they were merchandising different stores, right? And so they would pay them that time, but they weren't using that time to calculate overtime hours.
Oh.
So they would take travel time and kind of put it in their own little separate bucket and go, okay, you worked 10 hours of travel time, but you did 37 hours of work, but we're not going to treat your travel time as time worked. I guess. I don't know how they were thinking this. And so they would have, so what was that, 40, they have 10 hours, they would have 7 hours of overtime. They weren't paying them at time and a half for that.
Yeah, so travel time is time worked unless it's commuting from home. That's just a general rule. But I will tell you, having implemented many HRIS systems, that is a parameter you put in there, just like PTO, vacation, jury time. You say, okay, what hour codes do not accrue overtime? So someone, somewhere along the line, when they created the HR system, they just put that in that bucket, and it was probably just automatically hitting. So when the manager said, okay, that's travel time hours, the system, whether it's ADP or Ultimate Kronos or Paylocity or Paycor, just calculated it automatically that way, and it wasn't being caught.
Garbage out.
Yeah, absolutely. Good phrase.
And I heard, and I don't know if I would do this, Chuck, and I would love your opinion. I have heard that some companies will have a travel time rate. Mm-hmm. So when the employee is traveling, they get a different rate than when they're working.
Right.
I don't know. It just seems to me that's just silly, but
It is a little complicated, but if you have a robust pay system, HR system, then it can be done. But as long as it's minimum wage, John, as long as it's minimum wage.
Above minimum wage.
Above minimum. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so again, right? So again, we have to understand one of the things as HR professionals, as small business owners, entrepreneurs, we have to understand the Fair Labor Standard Act. It is critical, right? And so the original language, and I love this language, and I just get excited when I get to say it. Language says employees, says this to employ means we suffer or permit the employee to work, right? So when we employ somebody, we have suffered and permitted them to work. And so when I think about how we should be paying the employees, if we suffered or permitted them to work, that is hours worked, and they should be paid for that.
Sure. Do you have any examples to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I do. When I was working at a big corporation, I had a manager come into my office and was very upset because one of his workers had been coming in a half an hour early. One of his non-exempt workers had been coming in a half an hour early every day of the week for the last 4 weeks and was ending up making, I think, like 10 hours of overtime in that period. We had a clear policy that the employee could not get overtime without manager's approval. So the manager was like, well, John, she broke the policy. I don't want to pay her. Well, the Fair Labor Standard Act says that we would have to pay her because we permitted or suffered her to work. And so the manager's like, what do you mean we permitted or suffered her to work? I'm like, did you let her in the building? Yes. Did you have her computer? Did she have access to her computer? Yes. Did you take away her chair? No, right? And so we permitted this individual to come in and work. We didn't stop them from working. And so therefore we need to pay them for that time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And we have plethora of examples that we could share. We could be here for another couple hours on the HR Stories podcast, but I will share with you, every one of us has that super employee. Sometimes they're the front desk receptionist or somewhere, and they come in early. They sort the mail. They water the plants. They open the blinds. They dust the furniture. Arrange the chairs, and then they clock in. And I've seen that happen. And you have to be aware of it. You have to stop it because those are hours that they should be paid.
Right. And so I think that's a great story. That's a great thing. And I think I had employees like that would be like, oh, you don't have to pay me. Don't worry about it. I'm part of the team. I want to be here and I want to make sure this gets done right. And, it's always like, I need your hours. I need your hours. I need your hours. If you work for me, I need to pay you. Mm-hmm. And so, again, making sure they do that.
Yeah, it's all fun and games until something goes wrong, until someone puts an eye out. In other words, it's all okay until something goes wrong, and then someone remembers how they were not paid correctly, and it goes downhill from there. So, fantastic. So what ended up
let me tell you what happened in this story. Right? What happened? So this story is even a little more complicated, and I don't want to get into this because I know we don't have that many. We have listeners in California, but it's not our main base. And so this was in California, right? And so they have very strict employment laws about breaks and overtime. And so here's the bottom line. Home Depot settled this case for $72.5 million.
Oh my gosh. Wow, that is a lot of lumber to sell.
That's a lot, right? It's a lot. And so I will say that Home Depot said, look, we didn't do anything wrong, right? They're like, we didn't do anything wrong. We were, following, as they saw it, they weren't doing anything wrong. I don't know. When I read the case, it sounded like they did some things wrong, but it's still a good example of where small mistakes can add up to a large settlement, right? Because it was, right? The story, the main character was Jorge, but it wasn't just Jorge, right? This was happening in a lot of stores in California, and I forgot how many employees it impacted, but each one of them got this. It was a class action lawsuit, and each of them got a little bit of money, right? And so there.
Yeah. So what's your advice for HR professionals and managers and business owners, but those that oversee this?
Yeah, and so I have 6 points of advice. Number 1 is know the Fair Standard Labor Act guidance. So you need to know the Fair Labor Standard Act, making sure that if you haven't, make sure that you're reading up onto it, make sure you're doing it. I think we have in the book of HR checklist, the ultimate book of HR checklist, we do a good job on our FLSA checklist. So you can really go through that and go, okay, here's the details. So that's number 1. Number 2, pay employees for time traveled, pay employees for when their break is interrupted, when they work during their break, pay employees for waiting time that benefits the employers, pay employees for donning and doffing safety equipment. And so one of the things back in this Home Depot story is all the Home Depot individuals have to wear a safety apron. So you've probably seen their bright orange safety aprons. They were not paying them for that time to don that. Now, it probably didn't take them that long, maybe 5 minutes, but 5 minutes adds up after time, right? And so making sure we do that, and then paying employees overtime if they're non-exempt, and making sure you understand what a non-exempt employee is, being able to tell that the difference between non-exempt and exempt.
Yeah, that's great advice. You know, in the theme parks, both at the Universal and Disney when I worked, we gave every employee 15 minutes, so we called it walk time. That allowed them to go from their location to where they, had to change or go home. But it also allowed us to say, look, if you're walking and someone asks you a question, stop and answer it. You know, we're still going to pay you that time because we're providing that service. So that's great advice. Any last thoughts, John?
I think for my last thoughts would be to make sure that we're paying attention to state regulations, right? And so again, California and other states have very strict FLSA payment, break, and lawyer. And you need to know this, right? And so we don't have time on this national podcast to go into each state, but you should be paying attention to that and making sure that you do that.
Yeah.
How about you, Chuck? Any last thought?
Yeah, I do. Having procedures to follow, not only for your HR professionals, but your supervisors and managers, that is extremely important. All the stories we seem to tell, John, are about managers, supervisors that did things wrong, but also HR people that either didn't catch it, that maybe allowed it, or maybe enabled it. I don't know. But look, our reference guide, the Ultimate Book of HR Checklist, has step-by-step guidance that would have helped Home Depot not make these mistakes. It can help you, our listeners. You want to go to hrchecklists.com and actually look at our show notes below. We've got some links. And by the way, if you've got your SHRM certificate, this book is good for 3 certification credits from SHRM. But that's my final word, John.
I love it. I do want to go back to one thing that you said earlier and just kind of, it's an important thing. I know we mentioned a lot, but boy, make sure your supervisors and managers train. Chuck and I love coming in and doing seminars for supervisors and managers. We've dealt with this both from the HR perspective and the manager perspective. We see it from both sides, so we can really come in and kind of help them understand why HR is so important. Yeah. And so that's it. My final thoughts for today. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story.